This podcast is part of the Pull Up a Chair podcast network. Let's build community through connection, conversation, and collaboration.
What does it mean to be happy? 'Cause it looks like we all don't know. Glass half full or empty. Man, we just putting on a show.
Hi, I'm Jake.
And I'm V,
And you're listening to the It's Working podcast.
where we take deep dives into mental health, breaking stigmas, and starting conversations.
Oh, you know, I try to find a purpose in my life to drive me, to guide me. Oh, doctor, I feel dead inside.
We are not healthcare professionals, and our opinions should not be taken as facts or as medical advice. To see any sources, resources, or study we speak about in this podcast, please check out our website, linked in the description of this podcast. If you or a loved one is struggling, there is hope and there is help. Some helpful resources can be found on our website, linked in the description of this podcast. It's Working Podcast is a production from the Pull Up a Chair Foundation. All opinions in this podcast belong to our hosts and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Pull Up a Chair Foundation. We're going to pick up the episode here. Welcome to our episode about imposter syndrome. Jake, why don't you take it away?
Oh boy.
You look like a deer in headlights.
Well, yeah, a little bit, because from the last episode that we did, were we discussing that we were going to, attack, I'm guilty of imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
So were we going to, pick my brain?
Yeah, we were... Okay, so way back when the first episode released
Right.
of the season, we said we were going to come back to imposter syndrome because it was something that Jake, my dear, here, has not been willing to talk about thus far in great detail. And for all the time I've known him, it's like imposter syndrome is I don't want to say a keystone in your personality trait, but it's definitely one of the pillars that I see keep popping up
Oh my God,
over and
really?
over again. You never want to brag on yourself, but you were so cool.
Oh my God, I almost did it.
You almost did it. I saw it in your
just
eyes.
did it.
I saw it in your eyeball. You're about to tell me no.
Yeah.
Come on, brag about yourself.
Good
What's
Lord.
in your life?
Oh, I couldn't. I would feel so uncomfortable. I will say, I'm a pretty good shot at archery.
Okay.
I'm a pretty good shot at archery. I'm not the best, but I'm pretty okay.
So everybody listening, take notes. This is what imposter syndrome looks like.
Oh my goodness.
Don't go down the rabbit hole that he currently is, because we're all better than this.
Mm-hmm. Oh man. The imposter syndrome, I think it began when I was a kid. Obviously, I think it's a learned behavior at this point, growing up in a family where they constantly are the expectations that they put on you, and so it's not expectations that they put on you, it's they hold you to a very real expectation, even as a child. So it's wanting to be I don't know. So I saw Star Wars and I wanted to make a droid.
Okay.
And so my parents were then do you know how much goes into making one of those? You have to study robotics, engineering, you have to learn how to code. And I was I'm 9 years old and I just think it'd be cool to have a robot friend. And so it's being faced with that very real expectation of what's ahead of you that then sort of defeats you right outside, right before you even get started.
Yeah.
And so that was constant growing up, but it did keep me grounded. I'm given the two, I think I would rather imposter syndrome than an overinflated sense of self.
Well, okay, so interesting thing, large egos, there's several different mental disorders recognized in the DSM-5 about it, but there is nothing in the DSM-5 about imposter syndrome because it's not a recognized psychiatric disorder, but is a pathological condition. Over the studies that, the studies that were done on imposter syndrome prove that it is definitely something that happens, but all the studies on it were specifically on college students. And so the data on it is obviously very skewed.
Right.
But something that's like a regular pattern, which we heard all the time in your recollection or of your lived experiences with it, it is a focus on something that starts in childhood, where before you get started on it, there is a layer of expectation that you as an individual may feel like you might not ever reach. And then it goes on to the point where you might reach it or something close to it, but you aren't able to recognize that you actually have accomplished anything.
Yeah.
One thing I was reading about in a study done by the Canadian, one of the Canadian universities, and the name of it's escaping me, but I couldn't pronounce it even if I, so anybody who wants to read the study is linked below in the description of this podcast. They were looking at specifically graduate students, people who were getting their master's and PhD degrees. Right. Those students felt as though their knowledge on the subject that they went to school for is no different than when they had a bachelor's degree in it.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so it's all like, I'm thinking back to like tiny little Jake who wants to make a robot.
Yeah.
Since imposter syndrome has followed you your whole life, even if you made that little robot, you probably still wouldn't feel very accomplished.
Yeah, I mean, I did make a robot out of Legos.
Oh, see? There we go. You accomplished something at 9 that not every 9-year-old would do, is taking that initiative.
It just wasn't R2-D2 or C-3PO.
Okay, you're 9.
Huh?
Okay, but you were 9.
Yes, I was 9, but like, remember, the goal was R2-D2, C-3PO. And that's when my parents stepped in and was like, that's nice, but if you want it to be good... No, not good. But if you want it to be like, and they were, I can see the train of thought. Like, I definitely, looking back, can see, like, you know, that they were attempting to help and, like, spark an interest. Like, if you want it to be like R2-D2 or C-3PO, you need to do this, this, and this. These are the steps you need to take to accomplish it. But at 9 years old, it was very daunting because I am, like, technologically illiterate. Even to this day, I have trouble typing, just like normal typing. I like still hunt and peck, and I am not ashamed.
You should be.
I should be, but I am not, because that's just not in my skill set. I have tried so many times to learn like the way to type, and I cannot do that.
There's multiple ways to type. There's the correct way.
No, see, this is interesting.
There's other ways, and then there's the incorrect way.
This is interesting because I actually did not know that there are multiple ways to type, even though there's one true way to type.
Yeah.
I think spent the greater part of my life learning the one true way to type, and then I couldn't. Which is also, okay, getting back to imposter syndrome, I had a video game that I was playing that would try to teach me how to type. No.
Really?
It was like an old desktop, like, CD-ROM game.
Okay.
And it was Mavis Beacon Typing Tutor. I remember because it scarred me for life as a child. And the game was full of these, like, interactive typing games that it would try and drill you into, like, faster and, like, you know, more accurate. So the whole point was to not look at the keyboard. You would look at the screen, see the words as they move across the screen, and type them based off memory. And the games were... One that was particularly scarring to me was there was a family of penguins.
Oh, God.
And there was one penguin that was trying to get back to the penguin on the iceberg. And the only way to help the penguin avoid, like, the ice chunks was to type the word to break the ice chunks so the penguin could get by. And at higher levels, the ice chunks the words would get bigger for the bigger ice chunks, and they would come at you faster. So eventually, I got to a point where no matter how hard I tried, I could not reunite the penguin with his family. And what was even worse was when you couldn't type the word fast enough, the penguin would slam into the ice chunk and then be carried off screen, essentially dying.
Oh, I was gonna say, send me the link and we can share it with our youth.
No, I do not recommend this. I do not. I don't. Because there was also, like, all the games ended like that. There was one, like, Space Explorer game. And it was, like, again, like, you're a spaceship, and as you type, you blast asteroids.
Okay.
But if you couldn't blast an asteroid, it would collide into the spaceship, and then it would explode. Now, how is the spaceship moving, I ask you? Well, obviously, there's a crew on board moving that spaceship.
Oh.
Yeah. So no wonder I stopped playing that game and I never learned how to type because to me, failure to type meant somebody had to pay the price.
I was thinking it was like a little dungeon crawl or some cute and fun.
That'd be fun.
Okay, so
I would take a crack at that one.
We
but
need to
this
learn
one
how
was,
to code so we can make that game.
Yeah. This game was very heavy on like the theme of loss, and that was really rough.
Yeah.
Again, a child.
Yep. So you were thoroughly traumatized. They got you into jumping in on imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
I used to also struggle with imposter syndrome pretty bad. I believe I've gotten better.
Yeah.
Anybody who's listened to this podcast and then the other one I've done, also linked in the description, knows that I used to be really, really bad on it, and we did an episode where we only talked about our lived experience, but this time is a little bit different because we had a new co-host, and I'm bringing research into it because I am a little, not OCD, but I get a little obsessive about stuff because I want to know the answer on how to fix stuff. Like, that's always, like, my end goal with everything.
Right.
And so I've been actually doing these techniques on myself to help with it. So in one of the other studies done, again, on college students, I could only really find 6 of them, and they were all done on college students. So data very skewed, might not work outside of subsets. I was a college student for many years, so obviously I can relate somewhat to it. But the best method of coping with and eventually conquering imposter syndrome is not thought control, but there's therapy, obviously, works for everything, but there's talking yourself out of your feelings. So you basically go through thinking of, okay, so there is this thing that I think I am not good at. Let me list all the reasons why I am wrong. And I'm not going to think about the reasons I'm right. I'm just going to think about the reasons that I'm wrong. And if it's still something that I'm just naturally not good at, in my situation cooking, I can't cook.
Right.
Instead of focusing on the fact that I can't cook, and focus on things that I can do. Like working with recording equipment.
There you go.
And whenever it's something like, I'm thinking about something I'm good at, like working with recording equipment, I was like, okay, yes, I might have failed on A, B, and C on this recording session. But I know how to splice audio. I know how to set it for FM radio and broadcast it out, but I'm not going to do that because it's highly illegal.
Yeah, maybe not that one.
I know how to troubleshoot hardware issues. I almost know how to troubleshoot most software issues.
Wow.
I can name you each type of the different chord, and so you go through that. Every time an intrusive thought comes into your head, you talk yourself out of it, or you focus on something else that you are good at. And you got to do it over and over and over and over and over again until it gets a little bit obnoxious, and then your inner monologue will eventually adapt to the new line of thinking.
Interesting.
Yes, it has helped. I am not as self-deprecating as I used to be. And I'm really mean to myself. My favorite go-to joke is still the dumb blonde.
I have heard that one a couple times since knowing you, yeah.
No, especially in our foam fighting group, I was like, okay, you need to show me how to do that again because I'm just a dumb blonde.
Oh my goodness.
I say that to all the giant men that I smack with foam swords. I'm just a dumb blonde. You need to help me more.
That's fair. Also, that's a nice little segue into, I think, one of the more recent victories in imposter syndrome that I've noticed, is when the YouTube video Eye of the Ranger came out, and it was like a POV of the archery that I was doing, a lot of people started commenting on my archery. And
you're really good at it.
Thank you. See, I'm working on it, right?
Yeah, see?
But
you're getting there.
Around that time, my first response was to go, I'm not that good. And then I would say, because one of our brothers, Bairden, taught me everything that I know. I'm not the best archer in our group. Bairden is. I'm just his pupil. And I've heard from many people in our group, like, that's not true. You've adapted greatly to his style, and you've like made your own. And Barron's even told me that too. He's like, that is this thing that you did last Saturday is very you. That's a very you thing. You put a spin on the technique that I taught you. So I think I used a little bit of your technique where it was like actually confronting.
It's not mine. It was made by smarter people than
the technique that you just brought up about like combating those thoughts as they enter your head and being like, what I started doing was, because people want to call me the best, and I still don't know that I would call myself the best archer in our group, but I would say that like I am a good shot, and there are people who have like poured into me, and they've taught me a great deal, and I've also spent a fair amount of time developing and practicing my skills as well. So to that end, I will say that I'm a great shot. But I still don't know that I would say I'm the best, because I don't know that we've really encountered who the best is.
Well, how about instead of saying I'm a good shot, you start saying I am one of the best?
Mm-hmm.
Because definitely, coming from a person who's never teamed up with you, unfortunately, everybody's like, okay, first things first, we gotta kill the archer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do hear that a lot on the enemy team.
Yeah, it happens. So a little digging in, the actual technique example that I bumped into and I kept saying, for examples such as, I might fail this exam, you'll rephrase it in your mind as, I will do well on this exam. The power of positive thought.
Yeah.
In a future episode, we will dig in deeper to toxic positivity, which is definitely a thing. I don't think either of us falls into that category.
No, I don't think so.
But, because we're way too negative.
I think we walk that fine line of, like, realist, like, I don't know, not quite pessimistic, but definitely like
you didn't know me back in the day. I was not the glass is half empty. The glass must have a hole in it, because it's getting emptier.
Oh my god.
I'm a changed person, but...
It was more like the Matrix, there is no glass. There is no spoon.
We are no longer friends.
What? Wow, that's all it took was one reference to the Matrix?
Yes. Kicking you off the podcast.
But, like, the original Matrixes were, like, okay, right?
They were okay. Okay, I'm going to say this in full honesty here. People are going to subscribe. I thoroughly enjoyed the Matrixies.
Uh-huh.
I thoroughly disliked the fan base.
Okay.
They are what the Star Wars fan base is turning into.
That makes sense.
But, that is going to come up on the toxic positivity episode.
Sure.
Because, if the shoe fits.
Sure.
You're looking at me like, oh my god, this heathen.
I'm not looking at you like, oh my god, this heathen. I'm trying to, like, I don't know, the Matrix was great.
No, like it's good cinematography. They did great with the special effects, especially back in the day.
It paved the way for, like, the modern Marvel movies. Like, action like that.
Excuse me. My handsome man and spandex Spider-Man would disagree with you.
Spandex Spider-Man?
Spandex Spider-Man.
Tobey Maguire? Are you
in
seriously...
another life, I would have ended up with him. That's all I'm saying. That
I don't know.
Dance in the third movie and all.
I don't know that that's true. But we can get into that later.
Well, we'll do maybe a separate podcast where we talk about movies and disagree on pop culture.
Yes.
But the Coley Institute, speaking of imposter syndrome, that study, which I will talk about in a second, specifically, again, on college students, but on minority college students.
Oh.
And there's an interesting intersection between expectations of culture versus expectations of... You're pointing at me. What does that pointing mean?
No, like, I can totally see where this is going. Yeah, for sure.
Like, having the assumption of wanting to line up with your niche culture that you lived in with your family and the culture that you live with in terms of the wider world, which has been impacted even more so with college students with no real equivalency. I'm just going to point out, they say that, but there's no real equivalency because there's not done in the general population.
Right.
having that extra layer of expectations of being a college student, being a minority, and being in a culture that might not necessarily reflect the culture that you have at home, that all weighs down. And affirmative thought, we were just talking about that thought technique is called affirmative actional thought. What a mouthful.
Mm. Affirmative action
thoughts.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I really should have looked up who came up with that, but I did not.
Whoever came up with that should have come up with a better name for that.
I mean, it might have not have been them. It might have been their boss, because that's how a lot of these studies are done.
That's true.
The people who do it might not necessarily get the credit for it or get a lot of say in how it's used, which when we eventually get to our episode where we talk about religion, that's really going to come up in an interesting way because of how the DSM-5 was changed from 3 and how there was a lot of like political stuff that happens where certain things did go in and certain things didn't, because at the end of the day, unfortunately, politics does leak into stuff like psychology, which should just be a science, but it's not. It's not just a science because nothing is just one thing when we live in a very political world. That's a different podcast.
That is a different podcast.
That is a different podcast. I lost my train of thought. Okay, so I was talking about the intersection between culture, expectation, and how that weighs on a person.
Yes.
Because a lot of the time for those students who are in a minority group who do have all these cultural things pulling at them, in order to meet one's expectation, they'll fail at another one. Like, one of the greatest examples of this is coming from a country that is very conservative and then being thrown into a college setting where it's very liberal. Then sex is like the perfect example of it. The hookup culture, not meeting up with the marriage and family first cultures, mixing up with potentially families where arranged marriages are an expectation, and how a person like weighs into that. And in those specific cases, working through your imposter syndrome with your thoughts is obviously not going to be enough.
Right.
Because there's no way of reframing it. Like, you can reframe an exam, like you can reframe, I might not be the best, but I'm one of the best. There's no way of reframing two polar opposite identities.
Yeah, that's a task. That's Herculean. No way.
For that whole study, it all sums up to talk to a therapist and discover yourself. And it's like, well, in some cultures, discovering yourself is very disrespectful because you are a reflection on your family. I come from a mixed cultural background, and it's like, no matter what I did, I was wrong. So I think that's why, maybe not imposter syndrome hit me, but a lot of like my self-deprecation. It's like, well, I'm just awful no matter what I do, so it's fine.
A little bit of that too. Yeah. On my mom's side, more so than my dad's. I don't think my dad's side really gave a rip what anyone did.
Well, it sounds like your father's side would be like a lot more traditionally American then. Because that should be the more of the live and let live.
Yeah.
Unless it was conservative American, which is a very different.
I think it was hanging on the conservative side, but then it was very like
politically conservative or socially conservative, because those are also different.
I think politically conservative.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
But, because socially conservative, think the Duggar family, think the Brown family. Because that's very different. Like, just because you believe in certain politics doesn't mean you're going to live your life according to.
Yeah.
So we got to make that distinction.
That's fair. No, we don't really talk about our feelings on my dad's side, so I think it was I think it was definitely more of a, you showed up to Thanksgiving alive. That's the bar. That's the bar. Like, literally, that is the bar, and if you can do that, then you're in. You're good. I mean, even when I did my year in construction, which my grandfather, he was, on my dad's side, he was a journeyman construction, guy. He did his time in construction, retired there, and was very proud of it. He still had all of his tools from like when he was like, working, from when he became a manager to like then retiring. Had all of his tools from his old job, and I thought, when I started working in construction that it would be a point to bond with him.
Uh-oh.
But boy was I wrong, because we don't talk about feelings, and I mean, he asked about what I was doing. He did ask about what I was doing, but when it wasn't his department, I think that's when he became disinterested, because he worked in plumbing and irrigation, and he worked on the levee project.
Okay.
So he put a bunch of levees up around Sacramento area, and that was his life's ambition. That was his thing. So that was his thing. And then he found out I was in construction. I was like, oh, what are you doing? What? And then I was like, oh, well, it's telecom. It's installing internet. And then he was like, oh. And I think there was this thing about well, that's not real construction, because I was putting pipes in grounds and in the ground, and there was water going in and out of that, and sometimes people died or something like that. Which, I mean, it sounds crazy, but it was the time.
Okay.
I don't think there was a lot of safety regulations, and people could just do whatever, and sometimes people got sick and they just did not come back to work, and that was sort of the thing. It's a lot better now. I was not permitted to work without, proper PPE or face mask or anything like that, especially because this was in the middle of a pandemic. So for sure took extra care of our employees and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean.
So it sounds like on all fronts, your parents are trying to be helpful, but really drilling into you that you weren't good enough.
Right, so that was my grandfather, not even my parents.
Yeah, no, so on all familial angles.
On all sides, yeah. Although I will say my grandmother was probably the most proud of me when I was doing missionary work.
I could see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see that.
Mm-hmm. That's probably the most positive response to that. But yeah, so it goes deep. It goes deep, and it's a very difficult hole to climb out of. But I think. The technique you were talking about, I think, is, what I found personally is, most effective. Just combating those lies as they, come in, because realistically, they are lies that we tell ourselves,
Unless it's not a lie, then you need to focus on something else.
Yes,
because there's no reason to ruminate.
Definitely discern whether or not, you were lying to yourself versus just being honest with yourself. But if
I'm not a good cook. That's just...
And I can't type. That is just fact.
It's just fact. I think I got some recording of that conversation you and I had earlier, and I think I might just clip it on the Instagram because it was really funny. Mm. I got a question for you, though.
What's up?
So, would any of the following characteristics, would you subscribe to yourself?
Oh, boy.
All right. Do you find that you can be a bit of a perfectionist?
Yes, I think, yes.
Do you have a tendency to have anxiety or depression?
Depression for sure. I'm not quite sure about anxiety.
All right. And do you practice a lot of self-comparison?
Oh, 100%. I just gave 3 examples of comparison. Yeah.
So all of these personality traits have found to be the most obvious sign that a person has or will experience moments of imposter syndrome.
Shocker.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When I was reading, I felt very called out. I felt very seen, honestly. I just felt very seen. So the first study that I was looking at, I was talking about earlier, was done in 1978. Mm-hmm. And the most recent was done way back in 2021. Mm. So, decades of very little research on only, such a minor group of people.
Yeah.
And then I know that you mentioned before that you were a college dropout.
Yep.
How do you think that's affected your stint in imposter syndrome, your experience with it?
Oh, boy. I know it didn't help, for sure, because I went to a very high-achieving high school. I went to West Campus, which at the time was college preparatory, and one of the... it was kind of difficult to get in, so you were led to believe that there was a level of... Prestige that came with that sort of education. And so then all of my classmates, when we were graduating, they were all college bound. right? They're going to pursue higher education. Most of them, like, you know, of the UC variety, some of them were going to go to, like, you know, city. Like, I know a lot of my alumni went to Sac City, and that was only to do their, like, grueling education before they actually go to UC and finish up. So they were trying to save some money by going to, like, JC and then go to UC later on in life. So
that NIM is the smart kids right there.
Exactly. But then we also had kids that, you know, had it in their path that they could afford just going to UC straight out the gate and, like, finishing up there, and it was crazy. So I was led then to pursue JC because, like I said, everyone else was going to college and I was going to go to college too. It just felt like the next step.
Yeah.
Also, my school didn't really talk about, like, trades or anything like that. It was mostly like you're going to go to, when you go to college.
When you go to college.
Expect to encounter these things. It was not like if you decide college is right for you. You know, there was no other path really given. So I went to Sac City for about a year and a half, and I was floundering for, like, a large portion of my time there. I found one class that I really enjoyed was the early childhood education class.
Which, you know, gatewayed to the rest of your life.
Yes, which gatewayed hardcore led to, like, the rest of my path. But I found that class to be the most interesting, and then everything else was just a struggle. I really didn't like professors that on the first day were like, just so you know, 40% of students that take my class don't pass. And they say it like it's a successful thing. Like, you know, like, oh yeah, like, you know, almost half my student body doesn't pass my class. Like, that should not be something that you brag about. Like, your job as an educator, you should be striving for 100% success rate.
See, the thing about that is then every student that comes in expects to get a good grade because everybody that's come out expects to get a good grade. Mm-hmm. Coming from a person who has had to give out grades before,
mm-hmm.
you have to come off as a little bit of a hard ass so people will try. But
maybe so, but
that's not
passing is different from getting an A, I think. And I think you can have
there's a lot of people who don't see a difference in that.
Really?
Yeah, especially the higher up you get in education,
mm-hmm.
the people who are fine with C's and B's usually, like, move on with their life, and
mm-hmm.
they don't stick their head even deeper into the school pit.
Well, I'm very much a C and B type person, so maybe that makes sense.
Oh, my theory has worked out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all that little bit about school, that's my theory.
Mm-hmm.
Coming from a person who spent a lot more time in college than I would have liked, than my bank account would have liked.
Yeah.
I met my husband there, so it wasn't all bad.
No, that sounds great then.
No. So, like, I can see how you would have fit into a lot of the studies that I've talked about.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
But next week, we're talking about a subject that I know you are going to have, or I hope that you're going to have more information on than I do. We're going to talk about religious trauma. I was never traumatized by religion because I haven't went through what you went through.
Oh boy.
You and I had a lot of common experiences with, like, I finished college, you didn't, but
mm-hmm.
you were also, like, had the privilege to think of college as an option the same way I did, the same way all the students in all these studies did.
Mm-hmm.
So we had the privilege to be in that specific situation, and regardless of having that privilege, I'm sure people of all walks of life have struggled with imposter syndrome. So this was something we can relate on.
Yeah.
We're going to go into something that I cannot relate on.
Oh boy.
So I'm looking forward to learning from you, and that's one thing I would like to point out is I always learn something from you whenever we chat.
Aw, I do too.
Aww.
This has been very informative.
Alright, so as we always do, let's end the episode with a word of advice to our listeners. Why don't you start this time? What little bit of advice do you want to leave with people on the topic of imposter syndrome?
I think for my bit of advice, I want to reiterate the telling yourself the truth aspect of what we talked about. It's very important that you discern what is fact and what is not fact, and then when you encounter the self-deprecating lies in your life, combat them with actual truth in a positive way.
Yeah. That's good. And I will leave off at, it's okay if you're not 100% good at doing that the first couple times you try it. Let's see, it was like 2 years ago we released the first episode on imposter syndrome, and I think I've come a long way since then. So if you haven't made any progress by 2 years, go see a counselor. But be gentle on yourself during those first 2 years, because nobody is perfect. All right, we'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for tuning in. And we'll see you next week for a little bit of religious trauma.
Should be fun.
Join the conversation. Find us on social media at It's Working Podcast or link below.
Thanks for listening, and we hope you join us next week.
Be kind to yourself and to others.
What does it mean to be happy? 'Cause it looks like we all don't know. Glass half full or empty. Man, we just putting on a show. Oh, you know, I try to find a purpose in my life to drive me, to guide me. Oh, doctor, I feel dead inside.
Do you shudder internally when you witness a Karen going off on some innocent service industry worker?
Do you consume bad fan fiction and/or have tattoos from your favorite TV shows?
Do you strain to listen in on the awkward date stories of strangers?
Is your family the worst and you just don't want to feel alone?
Then we might have the podcast for you. Cringe With Me, the podcast where we dig up the cringiest articles, questions, and tidbits of human culture to review with you, our listeners, so you can cringe with me.
Look up Cringe With Me on your favorite podcast directory.
Only one way